Anyway, so in terms of grounds for divorce biblically, the first broad ground is sexual unfaithfulness. And then the second broad ground would be abandonment by an unbeliever. And in 1 Corinthians 7, Paul goes into some details where he says, I give you instruction, not the Lord, but I, where he's not contradicting what Jesus said, but he's dealing with the situation or situations that Jesus didn't address specifically. He's writing under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. And he is saying in verse 12, to the rest I say, not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever, she consents to live with him, he must not divorce her. Now, actually, my personal Bible reading, working my way through the Old Testament, the last week I've been in Ezra and Nehemiah. And in Ezra and Nehemiah, you have cases where the Israelites married foreign pagan women, and they were forced under the Old Covenant to divorce these pagan women because they'd married outsiders, unbelievers. And a believer in the New Covenant might think, and maybe it's a woman who came to faith after she had already been married, and her husband's an idol worshiper. Does that mean I should divorce him like they did in the Old Covenant? And Paul is saying, no, under the New Covenant, don't leave. Don't give up on this marriage, that your unbelieving husband is sanctified through you, your children. I don't think it means the husband will be converted or necessarily saved. He says you can't know whether you're going to save your spouse. But he says don't divorce, try to live and honor God within that marriage. And but he then gets to a question that he says in verse 15, if the unbelieving one leaves, let him leave. The brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. And so he's giving another scenario. He says, if the unbeliever will live with you, stay in the marriage. And this is an example of what might be a hard or disappointing marriage, which is part of the general principle as well, is that when we make vows for better or for worse, et cetera, that some people it may be God's will for them to stay in a difficult marriage, like being married to an unbeliever. My dad was not a believer. My mom was a believer. And I saw her until his death several years ago, faithful to God, faithful to him. And she did the right thing. The world might say, hey, go find somebody easier to live with. Well, no, Paul says you stick with it. But if the unbelieving one leaves, we've dealt recently with a case where a wife was converted and the husband basically said, you're no fun anymore. We used to go to drinking parties. We used to watch certain movies, and now you don't want to do that anymore. I didn't sign up for this. And there can be cases, even because the believing spouse is no longer desirable and the unbelieving one is the one who leaves the marriage, who files for divorce, who leaves the home. In that case, Paul says the believer is free, which also relates to the second question, and they're so interrelated, I'm not going to deal with them that much separately. Can you remarry after divorce? Again, in the book, I go into some of the Greek, which is actually drawing on people like John Murray from the 60s when he wrote about this, that free doesn't just mean free from that marriage, but divorce by its very nature means set free to marry someone else. And this goes back to Deuteronomy 24, when we had the example of, if a man would give his wife a certificate of divorce, and it was just assumed she'd go with that certificate. Now she's free, and she was just assumed she'd marry somebody else. In the Bible, as in the culture, then divorce wasn't just you're free from that marriage, you're free to marry somebody else. And so I would say both in the case of if you're the innocent party where your spouse has divorced you because they've abandoned you, or you're the innocent party where your spouse has committed adultery and you've chosen to go the route of divorce, that you are free to remarry. Now, whether that's going to be the wise thing is the second question.